So how has and hasn't your schooling up to and including Fairfield fulfilled Jefferson's goals? So some of
So
Jefferson's goals about the, I'm sorry, were you going to go?
no, you can go. Don't worry about it.
So some of his goals regarding education were to provide accessible education. He felt that all people in society, regardless of social class or where their economic stance is, they should be able to access at least some form of education. And then among this, within this education, he wanted people to be able to have practical knowledge for the kind of the time period, which would include agriculture, science, and technology. And one of the other big things that he promoted in terms of what he wanted people to learn was liberal arts. So like classics like literature, history, that sort of thing.
Yeah, for sure. And I think back then too, a main reason for the emancipation of slaves was just this holistic value of education for all Americans. And that goes kind of what you were talking about too. It doesn't matter what social class, doesn't matter your background, but having it be state, local provided education. So your taxpayer money, the taxation without representation. So your taxpayer money is paying for your children's schooling and you can control it at the local level. So there's that democracy. It's not all controlled at the government level. So I feel like that was some of his main things that he focused on as well. And good, fruitful merit meant a successful life. And so I feel like that has been prevalent in my schooling at points, just making sure that I got a free education at public school that I went to from K through 12. And they also provided options for me for state schools at lower costs than some of the private schools. And even when you think about the like foundation, he believed in merit very much. So I'm able to secure scholarships because of my merit, not necessarily always because of my social class, but like since it's like that, if you do good in school, you can get scholarships and go to a good school and not have to pay as much money. So I feel like that was how it kind of related to. What about
Yeah,
you?
I agree, especially with like my personal experience with schooling. I feel for the most part that it's kind of allowed me and prepared me to be like a functioning member of like the democratic process, and just rather than just kind of regurgitating something that somebody else has told me that seems smarter than me, I actually have the ability to comprehend these ideas and make a decision for myself. I'd say probably the only kind of issue I would have with the kind of the formal education system that at least I've gone through is some of the subjects that we've covered from any point between K to 12. It's just sometimes it seems like they wouldn't really be they wouldn't fall under like that practical kind of topic. Like if I wanted to be a mathematician, I would only that would really be the only reason where I would need to take something like a calculus class or like an advanced level calculus class, right? And yet it's still kind of a requirement in the a lot of the public schools today. So I guess besides that, I'd say I've had a fairly good experience with the public school system.
Yeah, and I guess to, you know, think of it as a different way too. Like, for example, I'm very math based. I'm like a finance major, but learning about history was very important for Jefferson. And even though like I never really had too much of an interest in history, it's like very foundational to create this holistic mind. And he also talks about just like weeding out the geniuses too. So I think that like those different subjects, perhaps math or sciences that you may not be interested in, those can also be ways to try to understand. Like you don't know it until you try. So it's like frustrating having to take those. Like for me, like sorry, Mr. Rutter, but I'm not a huge history person, but it just creates this holistic view. And the only thing too, though, is he wanted equality in his education. And so since it's funded by towns, it really does depend on how wealthy of an area you grew up in correlates to how well of an education you get. So I feel like that's one of the things that schooling has really put not me behind. I actually grew up very lucky, but some students at young ages are set behind just because of where they have to live. So I feel like that's
Yeah,
interesting.
that's a really good point too, actually, especially since the whole school system is based on the state level. It can't really be mandated at like a federal level, so there that will lead to a lot of inequality, even though that was one of his biggest
Right.
talking points as well.
Right. But then you want it to be at the local level because you don't want too much government control. So it's this back and forth. But I think school systems now pretty much have achieved what Jefferson wanted. And so to go into the second question, how do the Enlightenment inspired panel and institutions described by M. Foucault compared to your views on what prisons should accomplish. And so I just remember like the first couple pages, and it was like the horses were tied to his arms and his limbs and like pulling him apart. And so like that was their pre-existing way of dealing with criminals. But from your perspective of the reading, how do they deal with them now from his point of view and what they should
Well,
accomplish?
like it's funny that you mentioned that because it is kind of one of the more interesting aspects of this kind of like how we view the penal system and how we've chosen to deal with criminals like as we kind of evolved as a society. Like you said, back then we would just our go-to would just be, someone stole a apple from the market, so we'll feed them to a lion, right? And nowadays we
Yeah.
see that that's a bit extreme, and maybe there's better ways to go about it. To me, I think that prison should, I mean, to a certain degree, prison should be mostly a place of rehabilitation. And so to kind of teach these inmates to like allow them to understand like what they were doing is wrong and why it's wrong. But at the same time, you can't really apply that to every crime. Like if somebody, someone was a mass murderer, they killed 20 people, like it, at a certain point, like you're really not going to get that point across, and they do have to be punished. But for like the more lenient crimes, like maybe petty theft or something along those lines, it's definitely possible to rehabilitate them.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that his whole point of view on what prison should accomplish, and I also agree with you, is on page 124. It just said by keeping prisoners constantly employed on the productive works, they were able to defray from expenses of prison, and they were not left idle, and they were able to save a little money from the time when they were in captivity and would leave prison essentially. So they're able to work in prison, they're able to get a little bit of money from themselves, learn life skills, learn, moral skills. So then they have that opportunity once they get out to be able to, have a little bit money saved up because it's hard to get a job when you have that on your resume now, and also just not have to resort back to crime. You don't want to set these people up for failure. Of course, they did something wrong, and of course, they're being punished for it in prison, but you also want to be able to give people that humanity aspect, not just torturing them, but really trying to benefit them as a person so they can continue on with their lives. So I think that was pretty important, and that I also agree. And also, he just talks about like later on in the reading, 294, giving inmates supervision positions to help build knowledge in their self capabilities. So I was at the Monterey prison. So just like the same thing, like giving them knowledge, giving them skills, hardworking skills in different positions, so they can take those skill sets outside of prison and not end up back there. So I thought that I really liked that actually. I thought that was pretty innovative too for the time being.
Yeah, definitely. And it's also important because a lot of times the reason these people commit these crimes in the first place is because they weren't as fortunate as many other people, and they would have to resort to these things. And they also might not have learned these life skills outside of prison. So coming in, they would be, have very little education, very little concept of what moral values are. So if they're able to pick these up in prison, it would definitely be beneficial for them.
Right. It's just all just about circumstance. And I think that his main goal and what person should accomplish is, making their circumstances better
Right.
outside of prison. So we can move on to the third question if you'd like, if
Yep.
you're all
So for
set.
the third question, so how did the Enlightenment inspire penal institutions depicted by, is it Foucault,
I
relate to your
think
schooling
so.
up to and including Fairfield? So do you want to start with that?
Yeah, so I think it was interesting reading um text too was it was just talking about the structure of prison. So when the bell sounds, like you wake up at a certain point, you eat at a certain point, you go to work, and then you go home. And it's like the same thing as like a school bell when I was back in like high school, middle schools. Like you would go to your classes, like everything is very structuralized. You eat at a certain time, you do what you're told. Um, and so everything's laid out and structured throughout the day. And it's also that same theme of making us well rounded individuals and providing us with knowledge of skills to become successful in this real world. Because we haven't left the real world yet. Even at Fairfield, I mean, we went right from school to even more schooling. So we haven't been out in the real world yet. So it's the same thing, like just taking those skills, learning them, so then they're setting up for success and not failure.
Right. I think even this concept of like this routine that you kind of get in staying in prison, and even with school, like you said, how with the bells and the bell rings and you go to this room, the next bell rings and you go to this room, then you go to lunch and then you go home. It's kind of a similar concept in these like 9 to 5 jobs in the real world. You know, you get up, you get to work at 9, you clock out at 5, and you go to bed, and then you do the same thing all over again. So, I mean, I guess it really is a lot more similar than we realize. It's just really different circumstances and different reasons why we're there at all, right?
I know it is like kind of funny to think about it. Like if you just take the crime out of it and you look at a prison and then you look at a high school, it's like, very similar. I mean, we have the opportunity for freedom, but it
Right.
is different for sure. Like strange looking at it in that aspect. Um, and so just to like kind of bring all of the text together, um, okay, so this is the third text was very interesting. I don't know if you want to just like talk about it a little bit, but for me, it was I didn't know that this like brain mapping and like seeing images was a thing. I had no like prior knowledge of this. I don't know if you have heard of any of it
Yeah,
before the
that
reading, or
piece
what did you think?
specifically, I found particularly interesting as well. I had no
Yeah.
idea that this kind of, but could that technology kind of be like possible to achieve in humans too? Because I know whoever the scientist was, he said he only did it on rodents, right, and rats, and it was
Yeah.
the so. Oh yeah, go ahead. Yeah, I can't. But
Yeah, but you're right. No, it was, I don't think it was done on human subjects yet specifically, or maybe they were in the early stages of it. But it was just talking about how like our thoughts on page one of that article, it's just like our thoughts could theoretically be snatched from our heads. And so I think that's kind of can be used to see maybe if like in prison reform and stuff, like perhaps people could be found like guilty and they're truly guilty and our judicial system could be more honest because they'd be able to like read their minds and so no one would be in prison because they shouldn't be there or like a faulty I don't know system. So I think
that's a
that
good point.
that was
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, it definitely would help with refine the judicial system, and and like in terms of like would these implants make for a better society? I think it's really not that simple because there's definitely pros and cons with you could
Oh, for sure.
like
Yeah.
it's a potential human rights issue, right? Like go ahead.
Yeah, and
Sorry, I mean,
like Jefferson, no, but I mean Jefferson even he wants all of the knowledge you can gather. I think that's like the most important thing in American society, which brings up a lot of our morals today. It's a lot of innovation as we see in this technology, and it's a lot of pushing forward into the future. And so I think that um, he could have never imagined. They talk about it a little bit later on in the reading, like the Google Cap. And so, like many products in the Google ecosystem, it collects information about you, which it uses to help advisors target you with ads. And so now it's not only harvesting your search results on your map location, but it could also harvest your thoughts, your daydreams, your desires. So when you think about it, there's always this good intention in technology. And then if a company is able to have access to your thoughts, now they have access to your buying power and what you want to buy, potentially. So I thought that was cool.
yeah, and at the same time, like you can have this technology be turned on, like completely turned on its head, because unfortunately, with every technological advancement comes people who have some ill intentions. So, and one of those things that I saw, not actually in this reading, but I looked into this a little further, and this
Oh,
doctor
cool.
was talking about how if say this technology develops so much to the point where these implants could potentially just alter like all of your actions and everything you think. So if some hacker were to hijack this kind of thing, he could easily convince someone to commit some terrible crime and not be then that hacker would
Yeah.
he wouldn't be he couldn't really be traced back to it at all. People would just assume that this person went nuts. So
Yeah, I actually didn't think of it like that. And that kind of goes off text too, which was my first reasoning of why it maybe be beneficial is if you commit a crime, then they'll be able to see that you did and that you're honest about it. But perhaps you were given that desire to commit the crime, but you did not want to. So it takes
right,
away your personality aspect.
right.
Um, and so for anything I'd like to add, I would just maybe ask you what your opinion, like where do you draw the line between technology and like for like because this could help people for medical advancements. So like where would you per se like kind of a hard question, but
It is
would you
definitely
like
hard.
would you personally opt for this? Like, would you, because you could learn better, you could learn quicker. I mean, think about how much easier college could be. You know, you could like
Exactly.
do all these assignments in like 10 minutes.
Right. I don't, you know, I really don't know. I think if I were to take that step, I'd have to do a lot more research and kind of figure it out a lot more because, you know, like you were saying, like you could look at it like at a kind of like a surface view, and you know, you could be like, okay, yeah, I can get all my work done in 5 minutes. I can pick up concepts easy. But like, you know, like I was saying earlier, if you really dive into it and you start really thinking about it, you're like, you know, maybe this isn't such a good idea because I could be easily like, you know, easily manipulated with to do, you know, something that I might not want to do, right?
Right. I
So
would be the same way. Yeah. A lot more regulation needs to be done. And of course, a lot more research. I don't want to be like one of the rats, like one of the first people that
yeah,
got it done.
yeah, I think
But
I'll pass.
if there was a, yeah, exactly. If it's like regulated, maybe I see people like unlocking their like, I don't know, houses with their like wrists now.
Yeah,
So
I
I don't
think I've
know.
seen
I
that
think
too.
it's interesting. But yeah, that pretty much covers it. Is there anything else that you wanted to add, or are you all set?
I don't think so. Maybe just so one of the other things in the third article was that many of the some of the procedures and some of the like the scientists working today, it was saying right here how scientists who work to help paralyzed patients, for example, are already governed by HIPAA laws, which protect patient privacy. So I think, you know, if these implants do reach that point where it's like kind of a commonplace thing, we would definitely need, you know, some kind of laws and regulations in place, like you were saying earlier, if we really were to go through with this.
Yeah, I agree. HIPAA would have to come in at some point. Just like, which I think with a lot of medical advancements now too, it's how do you walk that line between patient care, but then going too far to keep someone alive or
Right.
have a better way of life. But yeah, I think we're all set.
I think so.